Cheryl said earlier, that passage has a lot of sheep in it.
It does. So does the service, right? There are so many voices that we can listen to in this world, and most of them are not gentle. They do not whisper, they clamor. They do not knock, they pound. You know what I'm talking about. Like the voice of fear that's always at the door warning you that danger is just around the corner. Or the voice of failure rehearsing your missteps like a lawyer building a case. Or the voice of shame, you may know that one well, whispering that you're not just someone who made a mistake, that you are a mistake. The voice of comparison, slick and modern, dressed up in filters and highlight reels. The voice of despair that curls up in the corners of your joy and tells you it's only a matter of time. And then there are the so-called good voices. They come with smiles and to-do lists and podcasts. They tell you if you just worked a little harder, prayed a little clearer, parented a little more gently, hustled a little more efficiently, or ate more kale, then maybe, just maybe, you'd finally feel whole. But you and I, we know better. We know that wholeness does not come that way. We know that wholeness can't be assembled like an IKEA set of furniture with the right Allen wrench and some perseverance. These voices are loud. They're persistent. And often they contradict one another so that just when you think you've pleased one of them, the others raise their pitch. Even worse, sometimes the voices sound like our voice. And even worse than that, sometimes the voices sound like God's voice, which is what can make them so dangerous. Because if we're not careful, what we can do is we can confuse all those other voices and the noise that they are making in our lives for the good shepherd's call. In John 10, Jesus says this about that call. The sheep hear the shepherd's voice. He calls them by name and leads them out. They follow him because they know his voice, which sounds really lovely, except how? How do we know when we're hearing the shepherd's voice? How do we know when what we're hearing isn't just our own voice echoed back to us in a religious tone? Or what if the voice we're following is actually fear-shaped in a faith-shaped costume? Or worse, what if we're trying to hear God's voice and we're hearing nothing at all? Most of us would love to have clarity. We'd love to have a spiritual kind of GPS system that says we should turn right here or left there. We'd love for God to just give us some divine direction, laminated and color-coded. But what we get more often than not is simply mystery. Sometimes God's voice doesn't sound like a voice at all. Sometimes it sounds like a silence that startles us. Sometimes it's a restlessness that just won't let us go. Sometimes it's clarity in hindsight, in the rearview mirror, showing us what we didn't see at the moment. And sometimes it does sound like a spoken sentence, but not always the one we were hoping for. The image Jesus offers here in John chapter 10 is not of a CEO behind a glass wall or a field general barking orders. It is of a shepherd, and a good one. The kind who calls each sheep not by number but by name. The kind whose voice doesn't dominate but invites. And the sheep follow, not because they understand, but because they trust. And that's really the distinction here. Maybe the shepherd's voice isn't something we can ever decipher once and for all, like a puzzle that we can solve. Maybe it's simply something we grow into, something we learn by heart, like a melody that stays with you, that's not flashy or forceful, but familiar and true. A voice quietly calling you, beckoning you toward wholeness, toward a life that is not just busy, but full and vibrant. And if we're willing to listen, not perfectly, but persistently, we might just hear the voice that knows our name, that knows us, and that is always intending to lead us home. The voice of God is humming, even in this room right now, beneath all of the noise in our lives. So how do we listen for it? We need to ask this, because the truth is that most of us weren't taught how to listen. We were taught how to speak to God, not to listen for God. We were taught to recite and to request and to confess, but listening usually takes more time than we have and trust we're not sure we can spare. And most of us, as many times as we heard the word sheep in this service, we don't like to think of ourselves as sheep. It's not really an American thing to enjoy thinking yourself as a sheep. And we like to be thinkers and doers and planners. We're worriers. We're trained to trust logic, to quantify outcomes, to prefer noise over mystery. But following the Good Shepherd requires a different kind of posture. It's not about decoding some spiritual Morse code. It's about growing in relationship. Eastern shepherds, and that's who Jesus is referring to here, didn't drive their sheep from behind. They walked ahead of them and called them by name. And over time, the sheep came to recognize the sound of that particular voice, not because it was loud, but because it was known. And that's how it happens. You know the voice of someone not because they yell, but because you've heard them say your name with love 1,000 times. Because you've sat with them in the silence. Because you've wept in their presence and they didn't flinch. That's the kind of knowing we're after with God. And the only way to get there is to stay close. We've got to remain. We've got to show up for prayer even when prayer feels empty. To return to the Scriptures again and again even when they feel dry. To gather in community for worship even when you're not sure why you're doing it. Because over time, when you do that, something begins to shift in you, and you begin to recognize a holy tone that steadies you in the dark. You start to sense something sounds like God, and you start to sense when something doesn't sound like God. The Good Shepherd's voice isn't always easy to follow. That's why we have to listen for it. Sometimes it leads us through wilderness instead of green pastures. Sometimes it says wait when we want to move or go when we'd rather stay. Sometimes it leads you right back to the person or the situation you'd rather avoid. But always, that voice is leading with love. It may come in silence. It may come in a song. It may come through the voice of someone who surprises you with grace. It may come through a nudge or through stillness or simply through breath. It's not about knowing where you're going. It's about knowing who is leading you and trusting slowly and imperfectly over time. And if that voice, if the one that you've grown to love and trust really does know your name, and you know it, then the question becomes, what do we do with it? What do we do with a voice like that? Because it's one thing to recognize the shepherd's voice, and it's another thing to follow where that voice is leading. Hearing is only the beginning. The Good Shepherd doesn't just speak to us for the sake of comfort. The Good Shepherd speaks to call us into life. I came that you might have life, Jesus said, and have it more abundantly. Not just breath in your lungs or blood in your veins, but abundant, full-bodied, full-hearted life. Now, we've heard that promise before. We've cross-stitched it. We've bookmarked it. We've quoted it in retreat flyers, but we have also misunderstood it. Because in a world like ours, abundance is often so tangled up with the idea of excess. More money, more safety, more time, more success, more applause or praise, more. We imagine it as a kind of divine bonus package, a blessing with a bow on top of it. But Jesus never promised us a padded life. Jesus promised us a whole one. And wholeness in Christ is something different entirely from the American dream. Wholeness isn't about having no pain or arriving at some curated version of success. It's what begins to happen slowly and deeply when your inner life starts to echo the one who called you in love. When your inner landscape starts to sound and feel like mercy. When your story isn't edited for public consumption but told with honesty and hope. That kind of life, the abundant kind of life, isn't always easy. It's a kind of life that will stretch you, and it's a kind of life that will send you, and it will ask you to lay things down that you thought you could never live without. Because the Good Shepherd isn't forming us into isolated islands or isolated sanctuaries. The Good Shepherd is shaping us into a flock. And that means abundance can't just be personal. It has to be communal. I have other sheep, Jesus said, that are not of this fold, and I must bring them in also. And that line really should slow us down a little bit, because it means the pasture of God is bigger than we thought. The circle of God is wider than we thought. The invitation has been extended to people we don't expect and don't understand, and maybe we don't even like. And if the Good Shepherd is still speaking and still calling, then we must reckon with the truth that God's voice isn't just about drawing us inward for healing, but about sending us outward in love. Wholeness does not happen ever in isolation. It happens when we begin to see others through the eyes of Jesus, not as interruptions, but as fellow travelers. Not as threats, but as our own kin. Not as people to convert or correct, but as people who are already being called by the same voice that has called us. And that's the other side of abundant life. It's not about having more. It's about becoming more. It's about becoming more human, more open, and more available to God's Spirit and God's love and God's grace. Because somewhere, right now, maybe even here, someone in your life is still listening. They're listening for that voice, and what they need right now is not a lecture. What they need right now is not good theology even, or a perfect, well-rehearsed answer. What they need is a voice that sounds like kindness. What they need is a voice that can tell them the truth, but not in a crushing way. What they need is a voice that can call them in love by name. And if we've heard that voice, if that voice has steadied you and healed you and continues to gather us in, then what we're invited to do is echo it. To echo it in how we speak, in how we listen, in how we learn, and in how we live. Because we are people who know what it is to be named and led and loved by God. And so maybe your calling this week isn't to do something heroic, but to pause long enough to hear the shepherd's voice again. To quiet the noise in your life. To open the gate up and to make space for the Spirit. To make space for your neighbors. To make space for friends and for strangers and for the life that is still unfolding from God for us all. Because God's pasture is wide. And the gate is wide open. And the voice of the one that has always known your name is still speaking and calling out to you and for us and for them. For everyone God loves, especially those who don't realize it yet. God is calling out to them and to us. And God is calling us into a wholeness that is wide enough to hold the whole world. Wide enough to hold it, wide enough to heal it, and wide enough to pick each and every single one of us up and carry us home. Thanks be to God.